Hello, I am Sarah Hyde Schmiedler, Manager, Multi-Generational Learning and Engagement at the museum. It's my honor to welcome you all to our program, Why Are Textiles Masterpieces? Asian Textiles in Weaving Splendor. Whether you are joining us via Zoom or Facebook Live, thanks for being here. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Captioning is available and enabled. Feel free to turn on live captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I will be managing our Q&A session and relaying questions to John Vollmer and the exhibition curators. And just as a reminder, when submitting your questions via Zoom, please select the Q&A option, not the chat. For Facebook Live viewers, enter questions into the comments section. We are looking forward to an engaging conversation, and as this is a safe space for dialogue, please be mindful and respectful of all our guests when commenting or submitting your question. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ling-In Liu, Curator, Chinese Art.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. I am Ling-In Liu. It's my pleasure to introduce Zhang Bauman, the internationally renowned scholar and curator of Asian textiles. I assume some of you may know Zhang well. For those who wish to understand more about his career and achievement, an easy way is to browse the section of Asian textile in the library shelf. You will find more than 20 titles bearing his name, such as the 3 examples here. He has created exhibitions and catalogs with the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, University of Alberta Museums, Art Institute of Chicago, and many more. I would like to emphasize his connection with the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. In 2013, Zhang was engaged as a consultant for a textile project initiated by the senior curator, Colin McKenzie. Since then, the curator, cultivator, and educator seated here today have been greatly benefited from his advice. Zhang is an excellent teacher. Not only has he never tired our endless question, but he also inspired us for exhibition and scholarship. In addition to guiding museum curator, Zhang continued to initiate projects such as the Conference on Silk with the Textile Museum scheduled for 2023. Today, Zhang will talk about his insights to the museum's Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Persian textiles. The video in his talk and in the exhibition are sponsored by Ruben Lade Foundation. We thank for their generous support. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Zhang Bauman.
Thank you, Ling-In, and my sincere thanks to everyone at the Nelson-Atkins who has worked so hard to make this program possible. My talk is about masterpieces in textiles and museum collections. Today, we tend to undervalue or ignore how something is made and pay particular attention to the what, and more importantly, the who that made it. The makers of textiles I will talk about are unknown, but each textile conveys coded information to a range of viewers, including us, that underscores its significance to a claim of masterwork, hence their importance to the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. These textiles are about designs and patterns, and most emphatically about expensive materials. They speak to status and prestige. I will talk about 4 ways of making pattern textiles: tapestry, velvet, embroidery, and jacquard weaving. Making involves many makers and remarkable levels of skill. At my request, the museum made a video to illustrate this talk so that you can better appreciate these treasures in real time. I first encountered Caravaggio's St. John in the Wilderness on a stopover on my way to university in New York, long before I studied art history. What makes it so arresting that I have never forgotten that moment? With oil paint on canvas and unparalleled skill, the artist gave me another way to see and think about spirituality. There is no halo, just a sexy young man sitting on animal fur with dirty toes. Before pictures decorated the interiors of the wealthy, wall-sized tapestries conveyed status. This example from a suite of 8 was made during the 17th century by the Lanier workshop in Brussels. The scene is from the story of Phaeton, who had begged his father Helios for permission to drive the sun chariot. His failure to control the steeds forced Zeus to hurl a thunderbolt, destroying the driver. As with all pictorial tapestries, the image was first drawn, in this case, by an as yet unidentified artist. Tapestry weavers interpreted those drawings and sketches at a loom using a palette of dyed wools and silks, working element by element on a prepared warp. The painting and the tapestry are familiar works of fine art at the museum, and in both cases are referred to as masterpieces. Tapestry weaving involves very simple looms, often just a frame. Large panels like the Phaeton series were produced on vertical looms. The loom holds a strong linen warp under tension. The weaver sits at the reverse side. The design is drawn on the warp in ink. A mirror mounted on the front face reflects the front work of the work back to the weaver. A full-size cartoon is mounted behind her. Numerous bobbins hold the yarn that are used as tools to interlock different colored yarns and for inserting the weft yarn in areas required by the design. The pointed end beats the weft into place. A toothed comb is used to further compact the weft, so it totally covers the white warp. The loom is tied up in such a manner that the shed, the space where the colored wefts are inserted, and the counter shed, which creates the weave structure producing cloth, can be controlled individually or in sections. Weaving is slow and meticulous. Although it proceeds from bottom to top, it advances in small increments in area where each color is required. It is essential that each weft be added to an existing area of weaving. Tapestry is the most flexible patterning of woven techniques. This textile uses the same tapestry technique I have described. Rather than wool, the wefts are colored silk threads and a silk thread wrapped with tiny thin strips of gold leaf on paper. It was made on a horizontal loom. Like the weaver of the wool tapestry, the weaver of this textile worked from the back side, unable to see the front. There would have been a full-sized paper cartoon under the warp to guide the color changes. The panel was specifically designed to drape over a hardwood chair. The upside-down bird is in correct orientation when hung over the back rail. The back section depicts a crane standing on a rock with lychee fungus under a fruiting peach tree. These are all symbols of longevity, conveying wishes for a long life, good health, and immortality. The seat area is marked with a frame medallion enclosing a lotus flower. It is surrounded by a conch shell at the top right. At the top left, an honorific object called a Rui scepter, named for the cloud-like jewel shape at the top. Below, a rhinoceros horn and crossed pair of scrolls. All are festooned with jewels and tied with flowing ribbons. These are lucky symbols, dealing with good fortune and prosperity. The longevity theme repeats on the apron section of the drape that hangs below the seat. Once again, there are cranes. They flank a rui or wish-granting jewel. The cranes fly above a stylized mountain and ocean billow pattern. Later, we shall see another representation of the terrestrial realm on a Chinese robe. To us, it may seem counterintuitive to dress a chair. Yet within late imperial Chinese culture, settings for events, whether indoors or outside, were often draped in textiles. Such a draped chair would have been reserved for the most important person in the household. Symbols of longevity and good fortune convey wishes for a long and happy life, possibly birthday wishes for the person honored to sit in this chair. The Japanese call this type of textile bijitsu sensoku, literally fine art textile. The name was specifically developed to appeal to Western buyers, the target audience for this type of fabric. Such textiles intended to be hung on walls suggest the aristocratic hangings like the Faden tapestry. The images are realized in a tapestry weave technique using plied silk thread with accents of a silk thread wrapped in tiny strips of gold lacquer on paper. The panel came to the museum by bequest from the estate of Ella Luce, widow of the Sunshine Biscuit King of Kansas City. They were possibly purchased in St. Louis in 1904 World's Fair in anticipation of furnishing a mansion on East Armour Boulevard. The scene is viewed through breaks in light blue clouds, a Japanese painting convention. The display of white peacock tail feathers evokes the work of the 18th century eccentric painter Ito Jakuchu. Printed books of Jakuchu designs were popular in late 19th century Japan. Americans working in Japan, such as Ernest Fenollosa, who organized exhibitions and built collections for the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, introduced Jakuchu to Western audiences. The mythical phoenix can be seen on many Japanese exports to the West. The subject matter would have been both familiar and exotic to the buyer. Although bearing the same name and both being products of the imagination, the Western phoenix is a symbol of regeneration, being born from the ashes of its predecessor. On the other hand, the Asian bird, called phoenix, was immortal and also known as king of birds. In Japan, the phoenix is often paired with paulownia, here depicted with blossoms on a gnarled branch. Japanese textiles like these were widely popular at the end of the 19th century throughout North America and Europe. Fading suggests these were initially hung, but during the first decade of the 20th century, the taste for things Japanese waned, possibly making these seem old-fashioned, and hence putting them into storage. Viewed through clouds creates the flat decorative framing device and often seen in woodblock prints, which were also popular in the West with the opening of Japan to the export trade beginning in the 1860s. In northern India, shawls like this were male garments. Those made of yarns spun from pashmina, or the finest hair of the Kashmir goat, were costly and associated with aristocratic privilege. They were prized for their softness, light weight, and incredible warmth. Most of these prestigious shawls were plain. By the 17th century, decorative end borders were added in twill tapestry weave that maintained a uniform texture and draped to the cloth. Over time, decoration increased to include side borders. By the 19th century, when this masterpiece was made, richly figured borders were made separately and sewn to the plain field, which has ornamental botta or cones at each corner. Here, double borders were added to the ends and sides. The precision of the spacing of elements and the integration of vertical and horizontal designs of this shawl are remarkable. Shifts in scale and subtle color changes in border outlines and alternating pear shapes create a sense of rhythmic motion. Embroidery enhanced textile woven designs with the addition of delicate details, such as the inner border on the plain field. The Western trade in shawls from cashmere beginning in the late 18th century and rapidly expanding during the early 19th were specifically aimed at women. The workshop producing this splendid shawl added an inscription that identifies the person who commissioned the piece. The person is named Nazoher. The inscription goes on to describe the work, noting the work is superior and the finest of the fine. To the left, a talismanic invocation, O protector, blessings to us, O generous one. The fashion for women's shawls in the West exploded during the 19th century. Efforts to attract customers at all price points is reflected in hybrid objects produced in cashmere like this stunning design. Square shawls that were worn folded diagonally, used less wool, and took less time to produce than the larger rectangular shapes. Efforts to effect further savings in time and materials led to the creation of pieced and embroidered shawls. Here, numerous small twill tapestry pattern pieces produced by many individual weavers were assembled into elaborate compositions. They were carefully stitched together, often with some embroidered elements. English and French traders were working directly with Kashmiri workshops, sending designs to India to match changing European tastes. Here, perfectly symmetrical, scrolling patterns evoke Western Rococo patterns. The nearly plain center area were often, in quotes, signed in imitation of shawls which carried actual inscriptions like that on the long shawl we have just seen. Here, crudely embroidered gibberish attempts to pass itself off as an authentic workshop mark. I suspect it was added at a dealer's shop in the West. Shawls of the period have various colored central areas. Some were apparently geared to the season or to the wearer's age. Such shawls had a sharply differentiated front and back sides, unlike the earlier twill tapestry designs, which were totally reversible. This back was never intended to be seen. The countless tiny stitches would not have showed when the shawl was folded for wear. For the wearer, the added insulation of loose threads between stitched areas would have been welcome in cool weather, particularly when a coat was not always considered a fashion necessity. Velvet is a loom-controlled patterning system that utilizes two sets of warps. One has a separate tie-up that forms the ground fabric. The second forms the pile pattern. On this loom, the pile warp is held in a frame with many spools on the floor below the ground warp. Pile warps are tied up individually as the pattern requires. The velvet pattern is controlled with a jacquard device using punch cards to control the engagement of pile warp threads. The weaver manages all changes of the warp through treadles operated with her feet. The weaving proceeds slowly, requiring time to insert velvet rods, insert the weft, beat it into place, change to the main warp, insert the weft, beat it into place. This is repeated countless times. Rows of loops are formed by the insertion of a narrow brass rod with each engagement of the pile warp. Here, because the pattern uses velvet only in select areas, the satin ground weave fabric shows. Cutting with a razor-like tool along the top of the rod creates the fuzzy velvet pile. In this design, both uncut and cut pile technique is used. Outside the museum, the following three textiles would likely be considered scraps. Inside it, they are treasured samples of some of the most coveted textiles created during the 16th and 17th century. They are Safavid period Persian polychrome velvets manufactured in workshops under imperial patronage. Velvet designs used many colored pile warp threads. Voided areas were enriched with supplemental strips of gold foil and gold wrapped threads. These glittering passages contrasted with the lush areas of jewel-toned pile. Areas once turned under allow us a glimpse of the original intention. This pattern represents the royal hunt. It depicts mortal combat between large felines and mounted aristocratic hunters. The iconography dates to the 9th century BCE. The velvet panel and the two pendant-shaped pieces once decorated the interior of an imperial tent. It was reportedly given to the Ottoman Turkish Sultan by the 16th century Persian monarch Shah Tahmasp. Following the collapse of the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1683, the tent used by the Turkish Grand Vizier was claimed as war booty by the European commander-in-chief, Prince Sangusko of Poland. Under the Safavids, the art of book, especially painted manuscript decoration, was a driving force in all arts. Seemingly endless variations of arabesque, strapwork, floral scrolls, fantastic plant forms abound in elaborate interlaced patterns. They enliven the margins of manuscript pages as well as the mosaics decorating the interiors and exteriors of public buildings. These repeating patterns on textiles embellished interiors as hangings and upholstery fabrics for cushions and pillows. Only the natural silk core of the weft threads remains. All of the gold strips have worn off. The pendant-shaped pieces may once have decorated the interior ceiling of a conical tent. It is a stretch to imagine the impact this textile had when originally fixed to the tent interior. The interlace of strap work with floral elements in brilliant colors would have been set against a highly reflective gold ground. The value of the pure gold strips can be gauged by documents confirming that later Safavid rulers had the gold strips pulled from the cloth to be melted down and put into the treasury. The Sangusco family kept the tent intact until the 1920s, when the velvet panels were sold to various museums and private collections. 16 velvet pieces are known from the tent. The Safavid Royal Library Workshop was responsible for manuscript illumination and the designs for carpets, textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. Embroidery is a patterning technique applied to an existing fabric. It can be placed freely anywhere on the surface of the cloth. It is the most flexible of all decorative textile patterning systems. It is applied with a needle or occasionally a hook. The fabric is held taut by a frame or a hoop. There are many kinds of stitches, each producing a different texture. All of them are produced mostly by hand, one stitch at a time. Here the embroidery is using a twisted silk thread, which is dyed variegated in darker and lighter blue. This is one of the best known Chinese textiles at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. It has been widely published and cited in many studies of Chinese dress. It is a semi-formal court robe called jifu, worn by all attending most court functions. We know it as a dragon robe. It was acquired in Beijing by Lawrence Sickman in the 1930s, together with 126 textiles, reportedly from the tomb of Yunli, Prince Guo. Yunli was a son, a brother, and an uncle of an emperor. The prince died in 1738, which provides a terminal date for this group of imperial fabrics. The main fabric of the robe is a heavy figured silk lampas. It is embellished with embroidery in floss silk, mostly in satin and long and short stitches, and with couched gold wrapped threads. The robe's decoration is a metaphor of the terrestrial realm over which the Chinese emperor held sway. The upper area symbolizes the firmament with clouds above the earth. The land represented by the mountain at the four corners of the robe. They rise out of the universal ocean surrounding the earth, represented by undulating lines and waves breaking on rocks forming the mountains. We have seen this configuration on the chair drape. The area at the lower hem is rendered as a continuous scene, much like a hand scroll painting. It is balanced but a continuous composition. The robe is remarkable for the way in which the decoration has been rendered. Although there is a strict symmetry, the two halves of the robe are not simply mirror images of each other. Each of the dragon roundels is drawn separately with many subtle differences. I have not encountered this on any other dragon robe I have studied. 9 roundels with dragons ornament the upper part of the garment, 3 at the front, 3 at the back, 1 at each shoulder. An unseen 9th roundel decorates the underflap under the front of the coat. 9 is a significant number. It has association with heaven and with the dragon, and hence with the emperor. The embroidery is extraordinary for its elegance and precision. It is remarkable, particularly when we consider the challenges presented by the very heavy and densely woven ground fabric that supports it. We cannot be sure if the robe was specifically made for internment. Study reveals the robe has been tailored or retailored 3 times. suggesting it might have been created for the prince while he lived. The 100 Cranes Robe name given by Lawrence Sickman, curator and then director of the museum, and his assistant Lindsay Hughes, is suggested by the plethora of cranes, symbols of long life used in the design. Wishes for long and happy life are reinforced by objects carried in the beaks of the cranes. They include evergreen bamboo, peaches of immortality, wish-granting jewels, pine branches, longevity fungus, as well as orchids and narcissus. This garment is a costume designed for performance on stage. Its intent was to deliver a visual wow. The Indian shawls made a similar visual impact, but within a much less focused venue. They were never envisioned as stage costume. While the Chinese dragon robe was also a type of stage costume, its visual impact would have been severely muted by the fact it would have only have been worn with a dark plain blue overcoat bearing rank insignia badges. Here, a silk fabric is covered with a grid of undulating lines enclosing two types of chrysanthemum flower heads. This repeating pattern has been created by stenciling an adhesive paste on the surface of the fabric, to which sheets of gold leaf are applied and burnished. Brushing away the gold not adhered to the cloth produced the dazzling background for the hem area of this robe with embroidered butterflies and swallows. The combination of birds and bugs is unusual and I suspect may have something to do with the roles this costume served. The embroidery is worked in glossy floss silk, largely in surface satin stitch. Stitches are worked with exacting skill in closely spaced parallel stitches. This technique creates very long floats, which produce uninterrupted surfaces to reflect light, animating patterns when the garment was worn. The highly refined and aestheticized no drama was perfected in the 14th and 15th centuries. It has continued largely unchanged. The wooden stage structure, which never changes, the extremely slow measured acting technique, and the minimalist music with chanting establish an austere otherworldliness. The sumptuous costumes for no drama, particularly those worn by the protagonists, are purposefully jarring. These roles, both male and female, are played by men wearing wigs and masks with padded undergarments to fill out oversized robes. The total effect reinforces the unreality of the performance. This garment type with gold or silver foil stenciling is called nuihaku. It is usually worn as an undergarment that is revealed at a strong dramatic moment in a performance. The last textile I will consider is not Asian. It is a French shawl inspired by the Indian prototypes we have discussed. It was manufactured to compete in an overheated European luxury market. The exuberant pattern is the product of the newly invented jacquard punch card device fitted on a draw loom. It was designed for maximum display, taking advantage of the increased expanse of women's skirts during the mid-19th century. The jacquard device permitted a shawl designer to literally control each thread independently to produce the complex pattern seen here. The device sped up production, making it possible to weave multiple examples of the same shawl. These factors impacted on production costs that eventually affected pricing. It is a good place to consider what we mean by applying the word masterpiece to museum textiles. It most certainly involves superb levels of skill and remarkable execution. It involves the manipulation of rare materials and using of complicated patterning techniques that result in objects that are compelling, often breathtakingly beautiful, and that move us with wonder and the desire to grasp their significance. Like Caravaggio's St. John, it also involves something extraordinary. It is almost impossible to describe, but whose presence is seen and experienced. When we brandish the word in the context of museum, it invariably implies a judgment based on value: financial, historical, rarity, aesthetic, technical. In the end, it is a very personal matter. For me, these textiles are masterpieces, and I've tried to explain why I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now we will cover some questions, so please add those to the Q&A on Zoom or on Facebook Live to the comments. Joining us to answer questions are the exhibition curators: Kimberly Masteller, Jeannie McCrae Beals, curator, South and Southeast Asian art; Ling-In Liu, curator, Chinese art; and Yayoi Shinoda, assistant curator, Japanese art. To begin, would the curators of the exhibition share why were these works selected in each of your collection areas for this particular exhibition?
I guess I'll go first. My name's Kim, and I work with the South and Southeast Asian and Islamic collections at the museum. When we developed the idea to showcase masterpieces of Asian textiles, we have so much wealth in the collections that people never get to see. And so when we thought about, well, what would be the really special pieces to bring out? I knew I wanted to bring out the carpets, the Safavid carpets and Safavid velvets and weavings, because they're real treasures in the collection. We wanted to cover cultures across Asia. And so for India, I thought that we had terrific examples of cashmere weaving that you could actually trace a trajectory of design through several choice examples. And so showing kind of some of the greatest traditions with great examples in those regions helped affected my choice.
Thank you. Ling-In, would you share about your collection area?
Thank you so much. So I like Kim and Yayoi. Most importantly, I chose the best quality and the good condition textile from the collection. And I also choose the earliest of the kind in the collection. So most of the Chinese textile in the exhibition range from the late Ming to the early Qing dynasty, roughly from the early 17th to 18th centuries. And I also balanced the types of object that could represent the Chinese textiles, also the basic technique such as embroidery, kersu tapestry, brocade, and copy. And one thing is that John probably know very well, textile need a lot of conservation attention. So in previous year, nearly about 5 to 7 years, we invest a lot of labor and budget in the conservation projects. So most of the textiles, such as 100 crane roll and the chair cover, has been recently conserved, so we can show them in the best effect.
Thank you. Yayoi, would you share about your collection?
Sure. So my first encounter with the textiles from the Japanese collection was actually with the survey that John and the curators at the Nelson conducted several years ago. And at that time, I was wowed by the beauty and technical mastery. John beautifully introduced it in the talk today. And it was just amazing. And so I was thinking about them for several years since that survey. And we also learned that they textiles from the late 19th century, from Japan, and I didn't know anything about them, and I was very curious. And for this exhibition, we did a lot of research, and with the help from John, we learned a lot, and they are beautiful works that tell a lot of stories. So for all of those reasons, I'm very happy that they are on display and that they have not been on display for a long time. So this exhibition gave us opportunity to show works that people haven't seen for decades.
Thank you. Well, our first question is, why do you think, or what do you think would be the coziest piece to wear from the exhibit in a cold Missouri winter?
Maybe I can answer this question. We have a woman's winter robe in the exhibition, which is a ceremonial robe with a fur lining on the collar, on the body, and also on the sleeves. And the robe will be easily to fit in our chilly winter. But in the Qing Dynasty, they not just wear one one ceremonial robe. Outside the core, they will have the base, and the woman who wear this robe will also have a fancy crown, fancy fur caps, and also a lot of jewelry. So with that very heavy costume and jewelry, I think it can protect the body very well.
And I'll just make a cry out for the wonderful cashmere shawls. I can tell you from modern examples, you would be amazed how something so light in weight could be so cozy and warm. So I can certainly recommend those as winter garments.
Yeah, and if you like a little longer piece to cover your body, then the Japanese uchikake robe would be a nice one too.
Great, we have some really nice choices there. Well, are any of the techniques showcased for weaving still commonly used today in most clothing?
I could answer that in part. The answer is all of them are used in varying degrees and varying whether they're hand produced or whether they're mechanically produced. I mean, most velvet today is on a jacquard loom and it's spun out by the mile. The very elaborately hand-woven, multicolored pile fabrics, I'm not sure anyone could even reproduce those Safavid panels today. Embroidery, of course, lots of machine embroidery that looks pretty wonderful. The question is whether each country, whether each culture still produces things. And the answer is basically yes. They're still being produced, updated to meet our market needs and our cultural demands.
Our next question is, did Asian countries have a leg up over other regions because of unique resources available to them, like silkworms?
Well, I think having silk, whether it's silkworms from Northern Asia or the wild tussar silk from Southern Asia, certainly gave East and South Asia advantages in terms of exports. We read about the importance of those both in the early Greek and certainly in Roman literature. And they, for many, many centuries, were the source of these luxuries that became, that they were the luxuries of global communities. And one of the things that's interesting about silk, both in its reeled state and in its spun state, is the sheer textile strength of the fiber. It allows a lot of loom maneuvering to happen without breaking. So pattern textiles sort of stem from the fact that the yarn is really, really strong and can take a lot of manipulation, even you would call it abuse. And therefore, things with beautiful patterns became even more luxurious. So yeah, there's a step up, a big step.
And I would just add, those Safavid textiles are so wonderful because it's during this period that the Safavids were able to take over a silk kind of development area around the Caspian Sea, and they captured kind of silk cultivating areas from the Ottomans, and it helped them jumpstart and invigorate a luxury textile industry, which they used very intentionally to build their diplomatic connections and build their economy. The other one I'll bring up then is the cashmere wool for creating the shawls, because that grows on specific species of goats that live in the Himalayas and the Himalayan foothills. And they are known to have the world's absolutely softest, finest wool. And so in Europe, there was such a desire to compete with these Indian-made products, these luxury wares, that they would import wool from India and Tibet. And then they tried to import the goats and raise them in the UK and later in France. And these goats, which were used to high altitudes and cool temperatures, most of them didn't survive the journey. And so there were some very kind of sickly small herds of goats that were being raised across the UK, but it didn't really work. That material was local to this part of kind of Himalayan Asia, and it gave them a leg up on everybody else's textiles.
Thank you. This is our last question. The floats on some of the woven pieces seem like it would cause the object to be fragile and unstable. Was this a concern?
I think that in almost all cases, the structure of the textile is critical to the success of what you're doing. I mean, a tapestry weave, despite the fact that the weft element is discontinuous, it only exists back and forth in the areas where it's used. It's beaten into place. The structure is sound. You can't tear it. In areas where, weaving patterns that use long skips or in the embroidery, yes, they're fragile. You can snag them. But by and large, these textiles were created to be used and to be primary displays of prestige and status. So despite their fragility or their seeming fragility, they were meant to be used. They weren't just fragile things to put in a museum. They were something that you displayed. It's interesting. We do not know what those Persian velvets were actually used for originally. We have examples of several of the patterns in other configurations and other collections, but they seem to have been specifically cut into these shapes to be made as appliques on the interior of a tent. So it's kind of, I think, an upcycle to something, from something to something else. And then, of course, it all came apart in the 1920s. And fortunately, it did, because now we know of them, at least 16 of these pieces.
Thank you. We do have another question. If all the extant parts of the Safavid tent textile were exhibited together, how much of the original remains?
Whoa, if we knew the answer, this would be so good. This is not my area, and Kim may have a better answer than I do, but I think it depends upon the size of the tent. And I do not know if we know what the size of the tent is. It implies, since it was used by the Grand Vizier, reportedly, that it was a big tent and would have had possibly antechambers as well as the main sort of area of the tent. And if you think about a conical tent with those pendant pieces, there would probably have been one in each of the segments of the conical tent roof. But maybe Kimberly has a better grasp of this.
I wish I did, and I wish there were photographs of that tent that have survived, and maybe someday we'll track one down somewhere in some archives of that tent, or maybe even more than one tent that was cut up in the early 20th century with these pieces being sold. I think we think it's a round tent, right? Because there's a round kind of donut shaped piece, the largest surviving piece of this velvet in the MFA Boston collection. And then many of the pieces that have survived are of this kind of lobed medallion shape, which match the appliques for the interior, which we do see on other Persian and Ottoman tent designs. If it is the round tent, those were, they're kind of like, as John showed, a yurt type shape, and they are called a karga, and they're kind of like an audience, a meeting hall. So it could be kind of like an audience chamber almost for the Grand Vizier or a prince or even an emperor to meet with close contact. And yes, it could have been the first of a whole kind of series of kind of interconnected kind of portable palace rooms. I've heard that of related pieces, and this is from Mary McWilliams, a former curator at Harvard Art Museums, that there may be 30 related pieces. Of course, not all of them may have been from the tent. It is a bit of a mystery. It'd be a fun show to bring them all together, but what we did in the installation, because it's hard to envision this as pieces now, as puzzle pieces, we recreated a replica based upon the scholarship about what it could be, and looking at Safavid miniature paintings from the same time. So when you come to Kansas City to see the show, which we hope you all will, to come see Weaving Splendor, it's on view through March 6th. We have a kind of a section of one of these round tents with printed velvets, printed replica pieces, including the MFA Boston's ceiling panel, which they kindly lent us for this purpose. So come see, and you can sit in a royal tent and enjoy the show.
Wonderful.
This question, I think, is going to be a challenging one. Among 4 types of techniques John introduced, do we know which one was invented first?
Well, first of all, just plain weaving has to exist in order to have embroidery. But I think of the techniques, tapestry, velvet, jacquard. Well, we know when jacquard was invented in the early 19th century. And so it would be the last of these to be invented. But certainly of the ones I talked about, the oldest would be embroidery. But in order to have embroidery, you have to have a woven structure on which to place it. Tapestry weaving is known from Old Kingdom Egypt, and we know it archaeologically from pieces that have been found throughout Central Asia. It seems to not have been invented in China, but to have been something imported from the West. But the pieces certainly would date from 7th, 8th century. Some of the, at least in China. Velvet weaving is a big conundrum because we have in some of the early archaeological finds of Han Dynasty, this sort of looped supplemental weft patterning. Not really velvet, but not anything else other than something like a proto-velvet. Scholars have argued backwards and forwards as to whether velvet was invented in the West or in the East, and the answer is, I don't know, and nobody has told me anything. So in sequence, I would say embroidery, tapestry, velvet, jacquard weaving.
Thank you. Well, this is another question about the exhibition is so beautiful and interesting. Is there an exhibition guide or book available for purchase?
Kim, would you like to say something about the Holly magazine?
Yes. This month's edition of Holly magazine has a, that just came out, has a article written by Michelle Valentine.
You are muted.
Thank you. I'll start over. This fall's edition of Holly magazine has an article written by Michelle Valentine, our department assistant and co-curator of this exhibition. Michelle wrote a beautiful article that features 11 of the works of art that's illustrated, that gives you kind of a survey introduction to those works. And then next, I believe May, we have a special edition of Orientations magazine devoted to articles based on textiles in the exhibition. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to prepare a catalog, but I would love in the future, it would be terrific if we had a publication of some of these textile masterworks. And so that's something that would be fun to explore, and I hope we can do it.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. We're at time. It's been a great virtual program, and I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to John Vollmer and my Nelson-Atkins colleagues.